Hello everyone and welcome to live coding exercise number 1. This is the Blackjack script introduction. I'm going to briefly go over a couple of the required tools that we'll be using, such as variables, if-then statements, while loops, for loops, and functions, as well as giving a brief overview of the structure of the program before heading into the live coding section, and then a quick wrap-up conclusion at the end. Some of the variables that we might be using today in this live coding exercise include numbers, such as integers, and setting variables equal to numbers. X equals 3, x plus 5, x minus 2, simple math. And these sorts of variables will be really helpful for keeping track of values of cards, user bets, amount of money that the player has, and any other sort of numerical data we might keep track of. The next type of variable we'll be using are strings, such as blackjack in single quotes or you win in single quotes. These can be really helpful for keeping track of precise information, names of cards, keeping track of the hands that you have, and communicating information to the user as well as receiving information from the user, such as whether you would like to hit or stay. Next, we'll be using some dictionaries, and dictionaries are similar to strings in that they can use string-like characters, but they have this colon right here, which is important. It keeps track of a key and an associated value in a set. So you can have multiple of these entries following the key value segment, and it can be helpful for keeping track of two pieces of data and how they interrelate. Next, we'll be talking about lists a little bit. Lists are helpful because they are a collection of objects. Here we have the standard definition for a list, and then here we have an example of a list in brackets. This list is 2 elements long and it contains A and B. Those are the 2 elements in the list. Finally, I'd like to briefly go over comment lines. When you see this pound sign at the beginning of the line, that means it's a comment, and it's not read by the Python interpreter. It's only there to provide context and information to the user. Now, during this script coding exercise, I will be giving a few lines of comments just to help break up the script, but I will provide a link in the final video description to a Python file that has much more in-depth comments to help explain what's going on. We're also going to be using a lot of if-then statements, and they follow the format of if, and then a logical test such as hand value is equal to 21, and if this is true, print blackjack, else, meaning if this is not true, then print no blackjack. This can be helpful, as you can imagine, for checking whether a player has blackjack, but also checking to see if a player is betting too much money or determining whether the dealer is going to hit or stay. All we have to do is give it a logical test, such as whether something equals something else or something is greater or less than, and then we can tell it what to do if that's the case, and if that's not the case, then we tell it what to do as well. We're also going to be using for loops, very limited in this exercise, but I thought it was worth going over. Here we have an example of a list. The list is named myList, and the list has 3 elements, A, B, and C, as strings. And then we have a new list, which is a blank list. And this is our for statement. For is the operator here. Each is a variable, and we're using it to assign the variable each as each element in myList. And what this statement will effectuate is that the code will look at my list and say there's 3 elements here. So I'll start with the first element, assign it to each, and then do whatever it tells me to do. So for this first line, it will print A. If it's on the second element, it'll print B and print C. So these first 2 lines of code will print out each individual element from the list. This next line of code will actually append each item to the end of new list. So if I ran this code, it would start with the first each, which is A. It would print it out and add it to new list, and then it would go to the next each, which is B, and then it would print it out and add it to the list, and then it would go to the next each, which is C, print it out and append it. This is a great way of doing the same operation to every single element individually within a list, without having to know how long the list is or how many elements are there, because it does it to everything and it assigns it to a specific variable that's temporarily held. While loops operate in a similar way, except a while loop requires you to know the conditions that this loop will run under. So for example, we might set a variable equal to yes and then say while the variable is equal to yes, do all this stuff. Here's an example of it will prompt the user if they can get another card, and if they want another card, then we'll do some code to get another card. If they don't want another card, we'll set the variable equal to no. Once the variable is set to no, this while loop will not continue. So just as an example flow, we start with our logical test. Variable is yes, so it will ask for another card. If the prompt is yes, if the response from the user is yes, then it will get another card. It won't do this, and it will go back to the beginning. But if the prompt is not yes, it will set the variable equal to no, and it will not go back to the beginning. It will continue on. This will be a lot clearer during the explanation of the live coding, so if my quick brief overview is a little bit confusing, don't worry. I'll go into a lot more detail when we actually use it within the code. But this abstract example is just one way of kind of looking at the structure of a while loop combined with an if statement that will control when the while loop will end. Finally, I'd like to talk briefly about functions here. Functions are generally speaking a way of combining multiple lines of code into one chunk so that you can run that same chunk of code multiple times over without copy pasting. So the way that this functions operate is we define the function with the def operator, and then we name the function. For example, here we're naming it deal card, throw our parentheses and colon on, and then in here we're going to put in whatever code we're going to use to deal a card. And then later, after we put in some more code, all we have to do is type deal card and then parentheses, and it will do all of this code over again. And we can do deal card as many times as we want. So this helps with condensing the code that you need to use, and if there's a certain function like dealing a card or assigning card names or card values that you might have to do over and over again, then we can create a function for that and loop through it. Again, functions are a little bit complex in the abstract, but once we get into the live coding example, I'll give you a good explanation of how they work. Now I'd like to briefly talk about the elements of the Blackjack script. So this Blackjack script, in general, we're going to start with the game setup, which will be things like creating the deck, assigning player money, and dealing with all of the initial elements that will just get the game ready to play. And then we're going to need to define how the turn structure works. So I've got a slide that goes over how the turn structure will work. And then I've also got a slide on what the player's turn is going to consist of and what the dealer's turn is going to consist of. And then finally, how we're going to handle the end of round. So during the game setup, as I alluded to in the beginning, we're going to build the deck and we're going to set the player money. And in fact, we're going to also create a file for saving the player's money so that each time you run the program, you can pick up with the same amount of money that you left off with. Next, we're going to prompt the user to place the bet. We're going to tell them how much money they have so that they know how much to bet. And then afterwards, we're going to have some code that will shuffle and deal out the cards, 2 cards to the player, 2 cards to the dealer. And then afterwards, the script is going to check to see whether one or both players have blackjack. If one or both players have blackjack, then the game will end and you will be prompted to start a new round. If neither player has blackjack, then it will proceed on to the player's turn where they get to choose whether they want to hit or stay. If the player hits and busts, the game will end. Otherwise, if the player stays, then it will move on to the dealer's turn. Then it will be the dealer's turn to decide whether they hit or stay. And again, if the dealer busts, then the game will end. If the dealer stays, then we'll continue on to the comparing cards round, which will determine the winner of the game at that point. We'll compare the values of player cards and dealer cards, and whoever has the highest card will win. Keep in mind that during the check for blackjack stage, during the player bust check, during the dealer bust check, and during the compare cards, we're also going to need to figure out how to handle the money in case the player or the dealer has won the game. We'll have to subtract money from the player if the dealer wins the game, and we'll have to add money to the player if the dealer loses the game. During the player's turn is pretty straightforward. We tell the player what the cards are that they have, and then we create a while loop. and that will allow us to ask them if they want to hit or stay as many times as they would like or as the game will allow. When the player hits, then we're going to check to see if they bust. If they bust, the game ends. If they don't bust, then it will go back to the beginning of the while loop and say, would you like to hit or stay again? Finally, if the player stays, then it will pass on to the dealer's turn. The dealer's turn is structured very similarly, where it will state the cards the dealer has, and then enter in a while loop to decide whether or not the dealer will hit or stay. If the dealer hits and busts, the game is over. If the dealer hits and does not bust, they will be prompted again to see if they hit or stay. And if the dealer stays, then it will move on to the compare cards round. One important thing to note about the dealer's turn that differs from the player's turn is that during the player turn, the player is asked whether they want to hit or stay, and we require user input to tell us whether or not the user will hit or stay. On the dealer's turn, however, the rules are much simpler. If the dealer has 16 or lower in their hand, they will always hit. If the dealer has 17 or higher, they will always stay. So we don't need any user input for that. We just have an if statement to check the dealer's value and to see whether they're going to hit or stay based on whether their hand is 16 or lower or 17 and higher. Finally, if both players stay and no players bust, then we move to the end of round. In this stage, we're going to compare the cards between the player and the dealer. If the player has the higher set of value of cards, then the player will get back the money that they bet as well as an additional amount that they bet from the dealer. If the player loses, they lose their bet. And if the player and the dealer push, which means they tie, then the player's bet is returned to the player, but the player does not get any additional money. So we are comparing the cards and collecting and paying out the bets, and then after we collect and pay out, we're going to want to save the amount of money that the player has to their player file so that we can be updating every time the game ends that money changes that might have happened during the game. Finally, we're going to prompt the user for whether they want to play again. If they don't, then we'll exit the program, but if they do, then we're going to need to have a while loop to enable the player to go back to the beginning of the game settings and start over again. We'll cover that more in detail during the live coding exercise. Great, so now that we've talked about the variables and we've talked about all the other tools that we're going to be using and we've given a brief overview of how the game will be run, we can move on to the live coding section. You're free to just watch what I write and learn that way, or you can open up a PyCharm notebook or a Visual Studio Code window, or even just something as simple as Sublime and code along with me. Keep in mind that the way that I do things is just the way that I've chosen to approach those problems, but you might have a better way or a different way of doing things, so I encourage you to try out different things, and if you find something else that works, feel free to leave it in the comments of the videos. Awesome, well, let's dive on in.